Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Housing affordability is a serious and widespread challenge in California. Indeed, Californians are spending a larger and larger share of their income on housing, than certainly compared to the rest of the nation, and as a result is really impacting our poverty rates. So what has or is going to be done to address this problem? Our guest is Lourdes Morales, who is a research analyst and specializes in housing with the non-partisan Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So listen, we've heard just how, it's been in terms of housing. It just isn't affordable in California. Just how bad is it? And how much of the pandemic has added or subtracted from that problem?
Housing affordability is a serious and widespread challenge in California. Households with the lowest income face the highest cost pressures. In California, 2.5 million households are cost burdened. This means that they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And over 1.5 million low-income renters face even more dire cost pressures, meaning they spend more than half of their income on rent. However, this challenge isn't exclusive to sort of lower income Californians. About 900,000 middle income households, so these are households that make middle income in the state around sort of $80,000 a year, are also cost burdened. And sort of this high housing cost pushes up the state's official poverty rate from sort of 11% to sort of 15% among the highest in the nation when you consider housing costs. And the pandemic, certainly in the short term, has increased the housing costs.
Yeah, I mean, people don't realize what's really driving the poverty rate in California is the housing costs. And I was looking at your report, and you were saying the average California, I guess if you own a California home, you're happy about this, but the average California home is 2.3 times higher than the U.S. average. So yeah, it's expensive. It's funny when I've traveled other places and you go look at other houses and they say a price, $500,000 or something, and you say, oh, that's not that bad. And immediately the person says, you're from California, aren't you? So yeah, it's well known. So what has the state done in terms of legislation and funding to really address this housing shortage?
So historically, federal, state, and local governments have implemented a variety of programs to help address with issues with affordability, both by sort of increasing the supply of moderate-priced housing, as well as for sort of paying a portion of households' rent. However, as the housing crisis has become more acute, the state has taken a more active role, particularly by supporting an expansion of sort of largely existing programs that help subsidize affordable housing development. So we see sort of programs that help local governments plan for housing, as well as supporting sort of direct housing assistance to first-time home buyers. There's funding in the budget for sort of new and sort of improvements to farm worker housing and student housing as well. However, because affordable housing is such a widespread problem, perhaps sort of more important are the policy changes being led in the legislature that help provide sort of more sort of flexibility and help increase housing development at the local level. And so collectively, there's been a number of bills over the last few years that sort of really help sort of private housing development that'll make the most impact over the long term.
Yeah, and some of them pretty controversial, right? Because they're saying that the state in some ways can step in and override some of the local decisions on zoning. So that's become a little bit controversial. I did something I wanted to ask you, and I forgot to ask you, and that was kind of what and where is the shortfall in housing? I mean, what is it all on the coast or what?
Well, so certainly it's the shortage of housing in sort of urban coastal areas that sort of initially sort of started the housing crisis. However, as urban coastal areas became more expensive, it did sort of push people to more sort of inner areas of the state and sort of also sort of drove up costs in those communities as well. So now we see, high housing costs throughout the state.
Yeah, and one of the things you're seeing, even in the Central Valley, in Fresno, they have some of the highest increases in rents in the nation, which is probably surprises a lot of people in terms of percentage basis. So the governor's making some proposals for the 22-23 budget. What is he doing in terms of addressing this housing affordability issue?
Yeah, so sort of as has been the case in recent years, the governor sort of continues to acknowledge the need for more housing across the state. And so to that end, the governor is proposing $2 billion for 8 major housing proposals that help spur housing development. These programs do largely reflect an expansion of current programs across the state that sort of support housing development. However, at the same time, the governor's 22-23 budget does reflect the secondary benefit about meeting the state's climate change goals as we're strategic in sort of where we build housing. So for example, the governor's proposing more dense housing development. So for example, sort of near jobs and schools and other community amenities to help sort of reduce the vehicle miles that you need to sort of travel to get from place to place and address climate change as we're also addressing our housing goals.
Yeah, thanks. We're going to talk about that in the next segment. We're going to do a deeper dive on some of these proposals. That conversation in a moment. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Lourdes Morales, who's a research analyst on housing issues with the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, about the governor's recent proposals to address the shortage of housing, particularly affordable housing. So the governor's proposing some additional funding for several existing programs that to bolster housing development specifically. I'm wondering if you could give a brief kind of overview of each, kind of, what are they, how much money are we spending, et cetera.
Absolutely. So the governor's proposing $1 billion in total for 4 housing development related proposals. Sort of first off is the Infill infrastructure grant program. So this program doesn't fund sort of housing directly, but funds sort of other activities that really are necessary to prepare a plot of land for housing. So for example, utility hookups, sidewalks, roads connecting to the development to really sort of prepare land to sort of increase housing overall. The state has allocated about $500 million towards this program over the last several years. And the governor's proposing a similar augmentation this year. Sort of collectively, this funding will provide about 13,000 new housing units sort of over time. Second, there's also the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities program. So similar to the program I just described, this program, while it does provide some affordable housing, it also funds other activities that help facilitate and sort of build a broader sense of community and sort of walkability. So for example, building dedicated bus lanes or establishing sort of bike share programs that also sort of have this added sort of climate change benefit by sort of building more densely, getting sort of cars off the road over time. And so the governor's proposing $300 million for this program that again sort of could develop sort of thousands of units of housing sort of over time as the funding gets allocated and sort of those units are built. Third is the excess properties program. So these are state properties that are not being used and are also suitable for affordable housing development. So the state has identified about 125 properties across the state that can be used for this purpose. And sort of lastly, there's an adaptive reuse program. There's $100 million for this that allows, for example, commercial properties to be modified for housing. As we know, sort of those properties are empty.
The stuff you're talking about, it adds up, right? There's 13,000 units for the first program you were mentioning, another 1,600 for the second, et cetera. It begins to add up. But the point also is that they're kind of combining goals here. It's not just housing, but also addressing the climate change issue and reducing vehicle miles traveled. So what is the governor doing in terms of affordable housing specifically?
Here we also see sort of a continuation of programs that the state has sort of invested in for several years that sort of have demonstrated success. Most notable is the state's low-income housing tax credit that gives tax credits to developers to build affordable housing units. When units are sort of funded through this program, there's a commitment that these units remain affordable for 55 years. And so this is sort of a long-term investment in affordable housing across the state. There's also funding for mixed income development. There's about 5,000 additional units that the state anticipates building as a result of this funding, as well as sort of more funding to sort of preserve existing housing stocks. As I mentioned, there's this sort of 55-year window. As older projects reach that time, there's needs to be sort of reinvestments to sort of modify and maintain and sort of update those units. And when the state invests more money, that sort of 55-year clock restarts. And so we are sort of preserving the state's existing affordable housing stock as well as creating new housing stock through this funding. And so again, we sort of see $1 billion being allocated sort of collectively for these various affordable housing programs.
Yeah, and they've also have something here for in your report about mobile home park rehab. Specifically that's kind of interesting as well. So listen, we got about a minute left in this segment. I did want to get your recommendations. What is the LAO saying? What is your assessment of these programs overall?
So, addressing California's housing crisis is one of the most difficult challenges facing the state. Sort of millions of Californians are struggling to sort of find both housing that is affordable and suits their needs. And sort of while the governor's proposal does propose sort of expanding sort of existing program, the legislature could assess if these programs align with the legislature's priorities as well. As I mentioned, sort of recent policy changes by the legislature sort of help facilitate more housing development. And so the legislature could assess if it wants to sort of invest in facilitating some of that. So, for example, there's legislation that allows for duplexes to be built on homes or to sort of split lots. And so the legislature could consider whether it wants to invest funding sort of towards those purposes instead, or in combination with what the governor's proposing. Sort of ultimately sort of providing oversight to ensure that funding that has been used is being used effectively before new funding is authorized will be important.
Yeah, and his assessment is always important. Well, I want to thank our guest, Lourdes Morales with the LAO, for joining us. So what does the building industry think about some of these proposals? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Our next guest is Dan Dunmoyer, who is the president and CEO of the California Building Industry Association, the leading voice in the state for the building industry. Welcome back to the Maddy Report, Dan.
Thanks, Mark. Great to be here again.
So listen, we've been talking in the earlier segments about what the state's been doing to improve housing affordability in California. I'm just wondering, in your opinion, what has the legislature and the governor done right? What's been helpful?
Well, they have done a couple good things. I mean, two in particular, starting with the governor. He's come forward with a clear understanding of some of our challenges, and that's in getting the current laws that he has signed into law implemented and followed. And what that really means is he's put funding into the Attorney General's office and into his Housing and Community Development Department to hold local governments accountable who play games with the laws of California. So that in and of itself, just saying to a local government who keeps on saying no to us, even though we've checked every box, held every hearing, done everything right, if they are going to play those games, he will have his team come in and say, hey, this project meets all the requirements. You need to approve it. And that accountability effort is really helping us create a better working relationship with local governments, but also a more accountable relationship. The legislature has done one other thing. They've passed two really good bills, Senate Bill 330 by Skinner, AB 602 by Grayson. Skinner's bill, again, makes it easier for us to plan by, again, making local governments set the rules at the beginning of the project and not changing them midstream. And Grayson deals with some of the highest fees we have in the country, making sure that the fees actually benefit the community for which they're being charged. So those are some examples of things that have worked.
So some good things, but let's talk about maybe the other side of the coin. What have they done that's been counterintuitive?
Well, I'll go the other side quickly. Governor on the one side gives and the other side takes away greatly. The one place he has really challenged us is his adding of regulations. So since he's been governor, he's added close to $100,000 per home in more costly regulations. Things like waters of the state, stormwater general permit, vehicle miles traveled. These are three examples of regulations that cause delay and add fees and penalties for building a home. So that's an example where there have been added costs with the legislature. A lot of it's their commitment to the environment, which we are equally committed. We put solar on our roofs, but they've added some additional costs in the process of basically moving through the home building process. Things like all electrification, decarbonization. These are cost more in California than anywhere else in the United States.
Yeah, and they are. I mean, the reality is that they are trying to hit two birds with one stone, as it were. I mean, increase housing stock, but also address climate change. And sometimes those two don't necessarily connect up. Let me ask you this. The governor's made some recent proposals to increase affordable housing. What do you think?
Well, we support housing for all. So we do charity housing, legally defined affordable housing, and market rate. The first home you and I would buy, hoping to go into the middle class American dream ownership. So we support the governor's efforts on affordable housing, but one of the misnomers is affordable housing is not affordable to build. It actually costs more to build affordable housing than it does to build housing that's affordable. And I'm not trying to be cute here, but with all these requirements and regulations. It's, like Liam Dillon from the LA Times put out this article that it cost $1,200,000 to build a 2-bedroom, 2-bath apartment in Southern California. That's legally defined affordable housing. So the challenge with the governor's commitments, we support it, and it's good to have that access for people to move up the ladder of ownership eventually, hopefully, but it's not cheap to build it. So we have to be careful. $1 billion in affordable housing builds less than 1,000 new homes.
Yeah, I read an LAO report, legislative analyst report years ago saying there's no way you can spend your way out of that problem. The state just can't afford it. Listen, we've only got 30 seconds left, but real quickly, anything else you'd like to see the governor and legislature do to address this problem?
Yeah, just quickly, just say, don't add any more costs. Pause the regulations, pause the bad legislation. Do help by putting some money into this year's excess budget to help with school facilities. We can build our schools without passing a bond. So adding that additional funding would be a great way to meet our kids' needs and build more housing.
Well, I'm hoping that they're listening to you. I want to thank Dan Dunmoyer with the California Building and Industry Association for joining us. When we come back, the state's non-partisan little Hoover Commission has also weighed in on this issue, and they've got some ideas on how we can improve housing affordability in California. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. According to the state's non-partisan little Hoover Commission, California is short about 2 to 3 million homes to cover its population. That translates to record home prices in California and California's highest in the nation poverty rate. As a result, the commission has some recommendations for policymakers. Our guest is the chairman of the Little Hoover Commission, Pedro Nava. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Good to be here.
So listen, you got a lot of recommendations. We're going to see if we can get through these quickly.
Okay.
First one you've got is you think that there should be more of a focus on home ownership as opposed to rental housing. Why?
Yeah, look, rental housing is important, and the state has done some good work with respect to that. But the fact of the matter is most people acquire wealth through home ownership. So, for example, the median net worth of an American homeowner is $255,000, while the net worth of a renter is only $6,300. So the state has been focused on rental housing, and that's a good thing to do. But we also need to make sure that we emphasize affordable home ownership.
Yeah, it's a lot of equity. Certainly for Californians, a lot of their equity is in their house. Second recommendation you have is you think the state should consolidate housing functions. Can you explain?
Well, it's always simpler if you only have to go to knock on one door to find the stuff you want. In California, we've got 4 agencies that are divided under the governor and the state treasurer. And so that kind of grouping, I don't even want to call it organization, that kind of grouping is inefficient. It results in confusion over who has what responsibilities, there's service gaps, and there's a disconnect between the state's goals and its policies. So if you put all these things together, reorganize that and formalize a strategic working relationship, you can put together better programs for affordable housing and improve the operations.
Yeah, economies of scale. It does kind of drive you nuts. You got 4 agencies doing essentially, a lot of, it's very duplicative. So third recommendation you've got is you think there should be a state should jumpstart affordable housing production. How would they do that?
Well, look, when California has a great model in what we did for wildfires. And we need to look at our housing issue the same way we decided that we had to approach the wildfire crisis. And so what they did with wildfires is they created a working group that had logistical and policy challenges, and they had a deadline that they had to meet. And they also made the stakeholders, the various stakeholders, and there were quite a few of them, identify issues that were important. We can do the same thing with affordable housing. And the other thing I think that is key, and we saw this with the University of California, Berkeley, what is going on with CEQA? You've got to take a look at CEQA to understand what it was meant to do and how it's now, I think, being misused.
Yeah, but as a former politician, that's almost like the third rail, certainly for environmentalists. That is a big issue. I don't disagree with you, but that is a big issue. Let me ask you this. You got another recommendation here is to fill data and analysis gaps. Why?
Well, because you can't manage what you can't measure. And the problem that we have is there's key pieces of information that are going to help policymakers are absent. We just don't have it. For example, the state, we don't even have a complete list of what development fees are imposed when homes are being constructed because they're different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. The other thing we don't know is we can't tell you how much it actually costs to build a home because the numbers vary from jurisdiction again to jurisdiction. So what we need to do, put together the information, gather it, create tools. The state is really good at putting that together, make that information available to local government at cost or even better, free, because quite frankly, we've already paid for it. We just need to collect it and put it in one place.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't measure it, typically it doesn't get done, which kind of gets to your next recommendation. That is about measuring progress. How do you go about measuring performance in this area?
Well, that's a bit of a problem because what happens is local jurisdictions are responsible for developing and then executing their strategy of how they meet the housing needs in their communities. Now, what we know is what needs to be built. What we can't figure out, the state of California can't figure out, is how much housing is actually built. And so we think that local government needs to be held accountable for actually producing the housing.
Yeah, which gets to that your next recommendation: enforce accountability. So how would you go about enforcing that?
Well, understand that the way this process works is that there's a plan that's generated by the locals. It's adopted by the locals and it's approved by the state. And then the locals are supposed to go ahead and move forward with creating the housing. But when they don't, there's very little that can be done in terms of enforcing local housing construction. So for the way to do it now, if you're a developer and you want to build that housing and the local government has not approved it, you can seek through the state a court order. Now, if you're a developer, you want to go to court to sue the place where you do business.
Right. That's not going to
happen. Right? It's just not realistic.
Right.
But so what we recommend, and I'm sure that this isn't going to be very popular, is that there be an ombudsman or an ombudsperson that is appointed in each of the jurisdictions to take a look at what's actually being done. And then if those housing permits are not being constructed, they have the authority to authorize construction.
Okay, we've only got about 15 seconds left, but I want to get your last recommendation is that you talk about investing in shared equity models. Can you quickly explain what that is?
Yeah, there are places and there are models already in place throughout the state of California where community organizations get together and they buy property. And because they are able to get favorable terms, the cost of it is lower than regular market rate housing. And we say the state ought to engage in that, approve in that, and encourage it.
Okay, I knew you could get through them all, Pedro. I really appreciate it. That's Pedro Nava with the Little Hoover Commission. I want to thank Pedro and all of our guests for being with us today. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report.
The Maddy Institute was established by a unanimous vote of the California Legislature in 1999 to honor the work of Senator Ken Maddy, one of the most effective state legislators in the last half of the 20th century. Our focus is on making the political process work through fact-based, bipartisan compromise and respect. Originally established at California State University, Fresno, the Maddy Institute has expanded to include the Valley's other public universities, California State University Bakersfield, California State University Stanislaus, and UC Merced, working together to effectively improve understanding and analysis of public policy issues impacting the Valley. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.